I don't want to hear myself on delay. All right, take two. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. If you are a therapist and you're like us, like most of the world right now, so much has changed in just the past month that we're trying to figure out, and you may be working your sessions through telehealth and online and adjusting to all of this technology and trying to do your work in a new and different way. And if you're like me, I've been hearing from a lot of folks saying things like, man, the work feels like it's really flat, or it's hard, or I'm feeling drained, or the minutes are going by so slowly in the session. So if it feels like you're kind of missing that spark, that sort of energy that you miss having in the room, we got some tips and some help to figure out today. We are joined, thankfully, with Dr. Matthew Pugh and Tobyn Bell to talk to us about integrating online chair work in therapy methods and kind of bring emotional depth to your sessions. So guys, thank you for joining us today.
Our pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Sure, thanks for coming. I'm going to give you a quick introduction. First, Dr. Matthew Pugh is a clinical psychologist in Amersham, England, and author of this book right here, Cognitive Behavioral Chairwork, Distinctive Features. Tobyn Bell is a practitioner of compassion-focused therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy in Greater Manchester in England. He is also a CFT, Compassionate Focused Therapy trainer for the Compassionate Mind Foundation. So guys, thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to start out, Matt, tell us a little bit about, if for anyone watching this or listening, what is chair work? What is this idea of chair work in therapy? What does that mean?
So chair work represents a collection of experiential interventions which utilizes chairs, their positioning, movement between them, and dialogue to bring about change in therapy. And typically when therapists use chair work, they'll find themselves falling back on particular forms or styles of chair work. So probably the most well-known form of chair work would be empty chair dialogues. So this would involve the therapist speaking to an other who is held in the empty chair. So maybe a childhood bully or an abusive parent or so on. Then we've got multi-chair techniques. So these involve the client moving between two or more chairs, each of which represents a particular thought or a particular emotion or behavioral motivation. And then last of all, we've got role plays. So role plays involve the client and often the therapist recreating or creating interactions which involve other people. So these might be interactions from the past, like historical role plays, or maybe helping the client prepare for a future interaction, like behavioral rehearsal, for example.
And so there are these different kinds of chair work, these different kinds of experiential interventions. Can you tell us like a little bit about what makes chair work different than just regular old talking therapy? Why do it?
Well, I think it's exactly that. It's not talking therapy. So Fritz Perls in the 1960s, he talked about his frustration with this aboutism in psychotherapy. You know, clients would come into therapy and talk about their problems, and therapists would talk about solutions, but it was all very intellectual. He was very frustrated with this. He felt it was much more effective to bring clients' problems into the here and now through things like chair work. So rather than talking about your problems, it gives you an opportunity to talk directly to those problems in the therapy session. Yeah. And yet that just stirs such an intensity of emotion. It's incredible to witness and be a part of. It could be transformative.
Yeah. So instead of just talking about it, it brings it alive.
Yeah, you're bringing it into the therapy room.
Yeah,
that's
awesome.
One of the things that they kind of say, isn't it? One of the sayings about chair work is that idea of sort of show me, don't tell me. So I think it's just that bit of, if you're trying to get a real handle and to see some of these relationships at play with the person and another person or between aspects of themselves, then it's that bit of, you know, can you show me it? Could we see this live? Can you
show me how that works out? Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you guys, Tom, I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm going to ask you to kind of show me and show us that in a little bit. But I hope you'll indulge me in talking a little bit about ism right now. Tobyn, let me ask you about How has this change to online therapy been for you? How are you experiencing stuff right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think it's like you said at the beginning, that kind of flattening that people get, I think it's really, really tricky. So I think sometimes in chair work, people are worried about the emotions going too high. But I think because of the kind of digital wall, I think a lot of the time now it's about how you kind of heat it up and how you use some of different chair work techniques and ways of working to really get people into these different aspects of themselves or different roles and relationships and dialogues. I think the kind of technique changes. It's less a kind of emotional regulation and more more kind of immersive skills. But I think what I have found is that because of that separation, that actually people have found it kind of easier to give things a go in a way. So there's less inhibition, I think, maybe because of that sense of distance. So people maybe can be a little bit more playful. Maybe therapists can be a little bit more direct because they're not so caught up with the emotion in the room. And also kind of clients have a bit more agency as well by holding the hand over the camera to do a particular part or stepping out of frame and coming back in frame. So I think some of the limitations of the digital work actually you can kind of use to your advantage a little bit.
Yeah,
quite interesting.
You could be creative with it.
Exactly.
You know, I saw a YouTube blog or something talk about the camera sort of takes away about 20% energy. So it's almost like you have to be bigger to add to it. So it's almost like you're saying, like you almost have to add this spark and turn up the heat on it a bit.
And I think that's
but
really
it's
true,
also,
actually. Yeah, like in terms of like lots of the work I do is more supervision, but people talk about how tired they get doing this kind of work. And I think it's because you don't get that fluctuating energy that you get in the room. But I think chair work is a nice way to really energize some of this work, to bring that back. Really.
Awesome. So let's get into some more nitty gritty type stuff here about how we may take this, because chair work is of all therapy interventions, maybe not of all of them, but of many therapy interventions, is one of the most active physical type interventions, right? It does involve a lot of movement, getting up, moving around, furniture, not this kind of face-to-face, just sitting here talking about stuff as you might maybe another kind of approach. But so let's get into the nitty gritty. I got one question from one of the groups. Melanie Dalton wants to know, just right from the start, where do you put the chair?
That's a very good question, especially if there are none in the room, right? You know, where do you put the chair? I think one of the things that Tobyn and I often talk about in our training is these kind of underlying processes when we do chair work. So those are things like separating out these parts of the client, bringing them to life through things like embodiment and personification, and then of course, bringing about the dialogue. Now, sometimes when we're doing chair work in a consulting room, the temptation is to separate parts by, bringing in an extra chair. But, when we're working online, we can use other ways of separating out these parts of the client. So maybe you don't need a chair. You could ask the client to stand to the left of their chair to embody a certain parts. Exactly, right. So this is the part that wants to, I don't know, give up smoking, for example. So you might speak from that perspective, and then you might move back to the center, and we might reflect on what it was like to hear from that side. And then you might move to the other and speak from the part that, I don't know, really does want to continue smoking, for example. And then we hear from that side and back to the center.
You can get me in trouble here, like I'm picking up a nasty new habit. But maybe if this quarantine lasts longer, maybe I might be speaking more from this side.
So it can be as simple as that, moving to the left, moving to the right, standing behind the chair, coming back down to sit in it. You can also use things like your hands to represent parts. This part wants to change, this part doesn't, and they can dialogue with one another. So the chairs, they're not essential in chair work, but particularly not so when we're working online. We have to be more creative, work in other ways.
Tobyn, do you want to tag on to that as like any other sort of creative adaptations you've thought about?
Yeah, I mean, there's different kind of creative means from it. I suppose the nice thing is that lots of therapists in their therapy rooms aren't ideal. So particularly in the UK NHS, you're often doubling with GPs clinics. So there aren't masses of chairs there, but so that's the kind of nice thing maybe about the online stuff, is that you can be a bit more prepared. So either you have that in the room as a therapist, or you ask your client to think about it before it starts. So could you think about how we might do this, and explain the process? So we're going to want to mark positions in space. So how can we do that? Have you got anything you could bring in, be it another chair, be it some cushions? Is there anything you can mark in space that you can move from and relate back to, so you can see a position that you've stepped away from, that will then kind of hold and contain the part of you that you've left there?
Mhm.
But Matt and I, yeah, exactly. But Matt and I had also talked about how you might use the chair with the therapist. So certain chair work practices where the client doesn't shift chairs but could talk to an empty chair. If they haven't got the capacity to do that, then the therapist can bring a chair alongside them, and they could look, and you could have another chair alongside you, and you could look at my empty chair next to me. So I could have it could be on my side, the therapist's side, and you could talk to the chair that I'd kind of brought along kind of with me in that way. So I think you can be creative and just slightly more preparation involved in that kind of thing.
I've heard people talk about like using objects even to, is that, I mean, is that something like a little objet here, an elephant? Like, is that something that you could use to, like, how would you do something like that, you think?
Well, I think it would just be choosing an object, the client choosing an object that they feel would best represent a part of themselves, and maybe holding the objects one in each hand, and then literally the objects can talk to one another. I suppose the thing that we have to be mindful of when we use objects is, let's say we're choosing an object to represent the client's inner critic. You probably don't want to contaminate that object with the kind of negative energy of the inner critic or an abuser, for example. So you might want to make sure that those types of objects are ones that the client can kind of, squeeze up and throw away in the bin at the end of the dialogue.
Yeah.
So just be mindful of which objects you're choosing.
Yeah. And let me ask you, how have, I don't know how much you guys have been doing this. I don't know how much you've done this before the outbreak happened, worked with people online. How have you found your clients transitioning over to this? Do you find that there's been an increase in, one example I might have would be when I sort of first introduced this with someone online, I feel like if there's resistance in the room, I feel a little bit more leadership and to be able to lead them through and walk them through that. I know from the online portal, if someone's feeling more hesitant about doing that or engaging in that, it feels, I guess for me, maybe harder to engage that or walk them through or guide them through it. I'm almost more likely to sit back and go, oh, okay. Have you guys found that clients are easing over to this, or it's tougher to navigate those rejections?
I mean, one of the things that I've kind of noticed is being a bit, like you said, a little bit more active as a therapist, maybe. So summarizing more, and when you're doing chair work, being a lot more active, because I think just to add to that immersive quality, because of the loss of intimacy you get from that. So I think more active maybe as a therapist, more summarizing, more feeding lines, kind of more regularly. I find those kind of things important in that kind of process.
One helpful concept that comes from psychodrama is the idea of warming up clients to experiential procedures like chair work, just like we get warmed up for, the day ahead of us by getting dressed and putting on our clothes and all those kinds of things. And I think probably when you're working online, you probably need to work a little harder to warm clients up to using these techniques. So some of the things you might think about doing are, really emphasizing dialogical language, and talking about parts and how they constellate or oppose one another. I think, as Tobyn was saying, you have to be more active. So you might want to use more gesturing in the therapy session. These two parts are in conflict, or this part sits behind that part, and that kind of thing. I think probably with those slightly more, reticent clients, I think probably modeling is the most helpful way to kind of warm them up to chair work. Showing them, what I'm going to ask you to do is to move somewhere in front of your screen that represents, I don't know, your detached side, and speak from that perspective. And then I'm going to interview it, and, you know, a bit like this. I'll ask you to come over here, and then I'll ask you to come back to the center, and we'll debrief. You know, and then the client knows that there's no trickery, there's no secrets. You know, they're in control of the process. I think that can really help. But you often do have to work a bit harder than face-to-face chair work.
Getting them warmed up and stuff. Tobyn, you
Yeah.
look like you got a thought with that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just reading about somebody else's commentary about online work, and they say it's the use of silence kind of changes, because the use of silence can be misconstrued with online, like there's a glitch in the system or something. So I think silence is an interesting one. I think I find I use maybe less of it intentionally than I would do in the room with somebody.
Yeah, so you're finding yourself maybe filling the space more.
I think so.
Do you guys remember the first time you had to do this?
Online chair work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my first experience was it was actually done to me.
Okay.
It was during my voice dialogue training, and we've been practicing for days doing this face to face. And my supervisor said, you know what, you know, it's important that you have your own experience of voice dialogue, but I can't offer it to you face to face. We have to do it online. And I was really skeptical. I thought, I don't think this is going to work, having done it, you know, in the room with him. But you know, I've got to say, within a couple of minutes, you're in it, just like, you know, you were doing it in the same room. And I think that got me converted. You know, it's a leap from, you know, physical chair work, but it's not such a big leap. You know?
Could you walk us into what was the skepticism? Like, do you remember like particular thought? Like what would?
I think it was things like, you know, are we going to be able to connect? Are we going to bond? Will I feel like I'm just, you know, playing a role to, you know, kind of keep the dialogue going? And, you know, there's apprehensions with them when we started the voice dialogue, but then you get lost in these roles. And then before you know it, you're doing chair work, which raises interesting questions about, you know, do we really need to share the space to do this kind of work? Is it essential? You know, it's interesting. Interesting to compare the effectiveness of virtual versus, you know, physical chair work.
Well, and I think that's a hugely important message to therapists, because I think if we walk in with our own skepticisms about this, that can really impact the work, right? Can really leave us not quite as effective in being able to lead our clients into this. You know, a familiar saying over here, at least, is trust the process.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people may get a bit skeptical as they're doing this, and that may impact the work. But the person who led you into that dialogue was like, he walked you through that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where, you know, the practice is so important, you know, to practice doing this stuff with, you know, a colleague or a spouse or someone that you work with. Just try doing chair work online with someone, and you'll probably find it works pretty well, and it works really well for them too. And then the less anxious you'll feel, the more confident you'll feel, and by extension, probably the more creative you'll feel trying these things out in your own work. So
Practice.
Yeah. At the very least, it's exposure.
Yeah. All right, Tobyn, I got a question for you. It's an amalgamation of Amber King and Pam Pilkington have raised questions. I know other people have a very similar question along these lines, that they're wondering about when working in online work, or someone's in maybe a detached kind of mode or place or protective place. They find that the people may be kind of talking faster or talking from a more intellectual part. So the general question is, how online, or even in general, do you get people dropping from talking from their heads to slow them down more to coming from their hearts?
Yeah, I think it becomes more of the kind of focusing work and more of the emotional language. So dropping just a lot into the body and anchoring it into physical sensations, and then elaborating it into postures and gestures. So trying, I suppose, like Matt said, is how do we use some of the core principles underlying chair work? How do we get them active in online chair work? And one of the key ones is embodiment. So I suppose it will be dropping into the body, kind of particularly exploring aspects of the part or role that they're playing, and then turning it up. So Paul Gilbert from Compassion Focused Therapy has this lovely one of sort of feel it in the body and then just turn it up. So can you turn it up to 10 in your body and notice where the energy would go? So where would it kind of move in the body as it's kind of widening in the body? Can you allow it to shape your body? And how does it kind of shape your facial expression and shape your posture? And with your gestures, what kind of gesture it make? What kind of voice tone would it have? I think that can really help it anchor it in the body and emotion. And it gives it an immediacy as well. And once you've done that, then it gives you a chance to, okay, so can you speak from that fist you have? Or, it's in the lump in your throat, can you allow that lump to kind of come out and have be verbalized? So you almost come into the body and then you give that bodily expression words in that way. So that's kind of how I might think about it too.
If I could throw you on the spot, hopefully this will be okay. If not, let me know. But if someone sort of came into a session and said, you know what, okay, we're sheltered in place and I just don't have much going on.
Mm.
And things are okay.
Yeah, I mean, one way you could do that bit about trying to amplify, or you could, like in, for example, schema therapy, you could be noticing and labeling this as a particular response or a particular coping mode, for example. And then you might use some more of the kind of voice dialogue techniques where I might then be asking you, oh, what does it feel like? And we might kind of give it a name. Well, it feels like nothing-y. And then, if that was a pattern we'd noticed, then I might say, could you just play that kind of nothing-y or shrug-shouldered part of you? And I can kind of ask you about how you're helping Jared at the moment, because, it's pretty tough being locked down at the moment. And it sounds like shrug-shoulder part that you're kind of looking after him by sort of switching off or pulling away from things and just sort of zoning out. And I wonder if you're kind of doing a helpful job for him. So you might kind of start like that, quite light, and then you can maybe explore how it has helped him across time, and maybe if there are any drawbacks.
So I could say something like, yeah, well, because what are you going to do? At least I'm not watching the news 24/7 and worrying and ramping up all my anxiety.
Yeah, so you say, oh, so kind of numb part or shrug shoulder part, it sounds like you really helped Jared from feeling really intensely anxious about the news, and there's lots going on, so it kind of makes sense why you're here at the moment. And how often do you show up for Jared? How often are you around helping him to switch off?
Oh yeah, when stress comes along, I just turn off. They might say something like that. I just yeah.
And do you help Jared? Has it started since the lockdown, or do you help Jared at other times where he just sort of switches off?
Well, back during when I finished my dissertation, I just tuned out. I watched TV instead of that kind of thing.
Okay. Oh, of course. So you've kind of sounds like you have a bit of a history of helping Jared, and if this was therapy, we could say, can you tell us a little bit when you first came around, when you first started to help Jared in his life, when he started to need just to switch off and to numb out a little bit?
And if you were to switch to the more anxious side, maybe the one who was vulnerable and panicking and wasn't the shrug shoulder side, how might you move me to do that here?
So Matt, I don't know if you want to
Matt, do you want?
Yeah, I suppose the hope would be that once you've connected with shrug shoulders and you've got to know it a bit better, you might ask the client to come back into the center, and you just ask, so how are you feeling right now? And it's often at that point the vulnerability will start to show itself, and then it's an invitation to the client. Okay, can I meet your more vulnerable part now? And the energy changes in the room at that point. The therapist will be, a lot gentler speaking to the vulnerability. There's also another neat trick you can do. You could speak to shrug shoulders, and you could ask shrug shoulders, can you tell me in the room where the vulnerability is that you're protecting? Yeah. And shrug shoulders will say, oh, it's over there in the corner. Oh, okay. What does it look like? If it could speak, what would it say to me? So you're getting to know the vulnerability through this protector in a safe kind of way that won't threaten this protective, shrug shouldery type side.
Almost like this entity over there. That's
yeah.
That's kind of interesting, actually. I hadn't thought of that, Matt, but when you're talking, I think I noticed I do more proxy chair work, by kind of saying, there's a place there, and if it was there, could you give it voice? And they talk from that rather than talking from that position, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
One quick technical question, and then we'll kind of a more broader level and wrap up here because I want to respect your guys' time. An empty chair intervention. An empty chair being when you dialogue with a person you may have had like an unresolved conflict with, right? Do you, how much might you do that kind of empty chair dialogue to that person, to the camera, you know, face looking into the camera? How much might you tell the person to pick a point off outside of and ignore this? Like, so would you as the therapist be there on the side, or would you have them kind of direct it? Would you even get up and move out while they address that? Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's just my personal preference, but I would probably have the client speak to a chair or a place in the room rather than to the camera, because I think, yeah, so over there to the right. And what's happened spontaneously when I've been doing this with clients recently, you know, clients often use laptops and mobiles or tablets, is they will speak from themselves, they'll move over into the perspective of the other, and they'll pick up their tablet and their mobile phone and they'll move kind of with you into that chair, you know, and I haven't asked them to do this, they just do it spontaneously. And it's incredible because then you are literally side by side with the client during this resolution of unfinished business. You are in not a weird way, you're in their lap throughout the whole process, you know, which makes things like doubling and feeding lines and encourage them so much easier. And it's containing, you know, you are there with them throughout. But this has been undirected, it's just happened. So yeah, I would be inclined to use the empty chair.
I think the thing is, lots of this stuff we just don't know. I mean, there's not research in this kind of area about what fits. So I think it's coming up with lots of suggestions, and I think it's being led by the client, what their preference is. Should we try this way? What would fit you? What would allow you to really engage with it? I think it's sometimes using the technology a bit as well, because with compassion, there's been some great work by an Italian guy on using mirrors, Nicola Petroli, if I pronounce his name right. But he did some research about talking to the mirror, so talking to yourself in the mirror. But here we've got a live camera playing back.
Live mirror.
So how we can So how can we use that? So it's again capturing one of the core principles of Chairwork of externalization. And here you've got externalized of your picture in the camera, and then you can, you know, look in yourself, gain eye contact with yourself, facial expression changes, and really connect. So I think in there you can use the technology for your advantage, and particularly when it comes to generating self-to-self compassion.
Or even have them snap a selfie and talk to that.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing, is that you can say with empty chair, just to create that separation and have an object to relate to, because that's the kind of key bit, relating to and dialoguing with. You know, you can bring in things like photographs. So Matt and I were saying that's another thing that you can do, you know, to dialogue with younger parts of you or different people, is to use as a prompt to get into it. If that's what you're trying to really bring up the immersion, is to bring pictures of self or others and to use that as a springboard.
Okay, last, kind of wrapping up from a broader sense, what words of advice or encouragement would you have to any therapists out there who may be struggling with that kind of skepticism or maybe even discouragement about feeling like this might not work or might fall a little flat? How would you encourage them, or what would you say to them?
I think my first piece of advice would be the practice. You know, just give it a go in a safe way with someone that you know and trust, like a peer or a co-worker. And I would, you know, it's okay if it doesn't work. You know, sometimes Chairwork doesn't work. You know, Pearl's called it an experiment for a reason. You know, it's exploratory, and sometimes it goes nowhere. And, you know, that's okay. You know, be compassionate when there are no fireworks and there is no drama. You know, reflect on it and learn from it. So practice with compassion, I guess.
Practice compassion. Tobyn, how about you?
I think the same thing. It's just that bit of like coming back to Chairwork's origin about spontaneity. We're only talking about that being a key part of psychodrama. I mean, it is being spontaneous, I think, being experimental, share the dilemmas, I think. And I think it's how, for lots of things, you can't maybe do everything, but it's then coming back to sort of core Chairwork principles and thinking, well, okay, embodiment, externalization, multiplicity, dialogue. Can we do, if we can't do all of them, maybe at least we can do something which would capture some of them. So how can you have a dialogue, even if it's having a dialogue between different parts of you and embodying it with one hand to another, and then they're externalized. So you've got those kind of principles live. So, don't give up if you can't do everything, but do some of the things and hold tight to the core conceptual aims, I think.
And I love how you guys both highlight that Chairwork started as an experiment. So experiment,
Absolutely.
be
Yeah.
creative, check in, ask your client, does this work for you? What thoughts might you have? Don't be afraid to do that.
One strange thing Tobyn and I have always noticed when we've trained people in Chairwork is, and I think this goes for online Chairwork too, the first time you do it, it's often incredible, dramatic, transformative. The second time you do it with a client, it's awful. Nothing happens. It doesn't shift. It feels like a waste of time. But make sure you do it that third and the fourth time. Push through those failures and keep going.
Keep at it. Keep at it.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about, you guys have an upcoming webinar on Chairwork and online therapy coming up. Do you want to give some details about where we can find out more about that?
Yes, so we're doing a one-day webinar on the 27th of May on cognitive behavioral Chairwork online. So the focus is going to be on using cognitive behavioral techniques, but we'll also be touching on compassion-focused Chairwork online and voice dialogue. We're giving half of the proceeds to charity, so it's for a good cause. And if you're interested in signing up, please join our Chairwork group on Facebook. That's probably the quickest way to find details. And we'd love to have you there.
And that group is called Chairwork.
Called Chairwork, that's right. Yeah.
And what will the charity be for the online training?
So we're giving half the proceeds to Doctors Without Borders for the support they're providing internationally during the pandemic.
Beautiful. Matt, Tobyn, thank you guys so much for joining us today and giving us some tips and tricks to help navigate this transition.
Our pleasure. Thanks for having us.
All the best.